Thank you, Dana, and welcome to everyone. And as I understand it, over 200 friends who are joining us, alumni, students, all getting together. And I'd like to say a special welcome, especially to former students who are joining us this evening. It's a pleasure for me to introduce Professor of History, Dr. Randall Law, who came to Birmingham Southern in 2003, and since that time has become not only one of the most distinguished members of our faculty, but also a nationally recognized historian. A specialist in Russian history, having received his master's degree from Yale University in Russian Studies and a PhD from Georgetown University, he has had numerous books and articles published, particularly on the history of terrorism, including Terrorism, a History, which will be in its third edition this next year. He is also the editor of the Routledge History of Terrorism. Speaking to us tonight on the current invasion of the Ukraine, Dr. Law, who is himself fluent in Russian, brings a wealth of experience, having visited the Ukraine on numerous occasions, and in 2009, he spent 4 months with his family in Odessa as the prestigious Fulbright Research Scholar. So, without anything else, let's get to this evening's important topic. Dr. Law.
Thank you, Dr. Lester. I very much appreciate the introduction. I'm going to jump right in. It's gratifying to see so many people who are joining us from all over. Thank you. Who are interested in learning about what's going on in Ukraine right now. I hope you come away from this presentation enlightened. I do want to be honest right up front. Historians generally emphasize the gray areas, the competing perspectives, and typically reminding their audiences, and in my case, my students, to hold themselves aloft from judgment so that they can come to better conclusions. So I've studied Russia and Ukraine for 30 years now, which provides a certain expertise. But it also means that I've gotten close to these countries and these people and these cultures. I've lived in Moscow and, as Dr. Lester said, in Odessa. I love the Russian language. I love its culture. But I've grown particularly fond of the Ukrainian people and their country. So that really means that these past few days this past week has been very painful. So I'm going to be blunter in some of my conclusions than I might normally be. Perhaps a little less circumspect than an academic is supposed to be. But my responsibility here is, if I'm going to be blunt, to get my historical reasoning behind those ideas right. So let's start off. Where is Ukraine? Ukraine is the second largest country by land in Europe after Russia. It's the seventh largest European country by population. Its capital, Kyiv, is the seventh largest city in Europe. So this is not small potatoes. Ukraine has some of the most fertile land in the world. It's routinely called the breadbasket of Europe. It grows enormous quantities of grain for export. It's probably best known for sunflowers. The sunflower is the national flower of Ukraine. And in fact, the Ukrainian flag, the blue over the yellow symbolizes the blue sky over yellow fields of grain and sunflowers. So who lives in Ukraine. This is both I love maps. This is a great map and a bad map because it has a lot of information and because it has a lot of information. Everything except for the brown area at the bottom, the Crimean Peninsula, is majority ethnically Ukrainian. The pink and the red in the north and west is Ukrainian speaking. The brown, the yellow, and the tan signifies Russian speaking. In other words, we have Russians speaking Russian, mostly in the far east and the far south, Ukrainians speaking Russian across the south and into the middle of the country, and Ukrainians speaking Ukrainian, particularly in the north and the west. I also want to point out that until World War II, there were very many Jews living in Ukraine. Ukraine had the highest percentage of Jews of any part of the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union. Jews have been a really integral part of Ukraine and its history and its identity, and have contributed an extraordinary amount to the culture and the richness of Ukraine. It also means, and this, we need to acknowledge this, it means that there has been a long history of anti-Semitism in Ukraine as well. And I'll return to that and talk about that a little bit later. I also want to note, let's make sure we use the most appropriate language, which honors the history and the identity of the Ukrainian people. First of all, let's just call it Ukraine. The Ukraine is associated often typically with colonial subjects, the Congo, the Gambia, the Sudan, so on and so forth. It also makes sense because there are actually no articles in Russian or Ukrainian, so it's actually impossible to say the Ukraine. That's an English introduction. Also, the names of cities. We could go on and on about Lviv versus Lvov, Kharkiv versus Kharkov. In particular, most people know the capital of Ukraine as Kiev. That's the Russian pronunciation and spelling of the city. It's okay to say chicken Kiev still, because that's a culinary dish. But when we're speaking of the city, Kyiv is the Russian spelling and the Russian pronunciation of the city. Russian President Vladimir Putin. He has been clear for years and has become increasingly explicit in recent months in saying what has driven the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In short, and I'm obviously going to talk about this more, Putin means to correct what he has repeatedly said is the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. That's his quote. The collapse and dismemberment of the Soviet Union in 1991. Here's a map of the Soviet Union with its constituent republics, of which there were 15 during the second half of the existence of the Soviet Union. Let's be very clear. People know that Vladimir Putin was a KGB officer. He was stationed in East Germany at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Putin is no communist. He has no nostalgia for communism. He was a Soviet patriot, and in the 30 years since the end of the Soviet Union, that means he has turned into for all intents and purposes, a Russian nationalist. For Putin, the Soviet Union was a superpower. And that was the reason for the pride, the identification in it. And so this means not just the size, the scale of the Soviet Union, which mostly in terms of territory was refashioned from the Russian Empire, but also the Soviet status as a superpower means look to the left, look to the map on the left here, was that the Soviet Union as a superpower controlled a series of puppet states east of the Iron Curtain, as it were, during the Cold War from this string of puppet states controlled from Moscow, in which that had basically economic, political, military systems that were imposed by Moscow as well. This string of puppet states in Eastern Europe ensured Russian security, wealth, prestige, and international influence. This is what, the end of this is what Putin terribly regrets. And so to correct this tragedy, as he calls it, the collapse of the Soviet Union, Putin essentially means to remake the results of the end of the Cold War. This means then in the 1990s, the growth of American influence in Russia. Here's a McDonald's. I actually went to the very first McDonald's that opened in, at that time, still the Soviet Union in 1990. At that time, the largest McDonald's in the entire world. For many, it was a novelty. For somebody like a Putin, it was a sign of deep humiliation. To have Western culture come in and have Russians be so transfixed by it. Now you can look to the map on the right. It wasn't just the spread of American culture and values. It, of course, was also the eastward creep of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which had been developed in 1949, created in 1949, a union of the United States, Canada, and Western European countries to resist Soviet aggression. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, NATO moved eastward, and it took in many new member states, the last round of which was in 2009. And it took in new member states that were the former puppets, the satellite countries of the Soviet Union, and even in the case of the three Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. NATO expanded to actually include former republics of the Soviet Union. In other words, to include parts of the former Soviet Union. Okay, and so Ukraine, which in the map on the right, in gold, is central to all of this. While Ukraine has not joined NATO or the European Union, it has been the explicit goal of Ukrainian leaders for the last decade, and it's an idea supported by a majority of Ukrainian citizens. The last time a poll was taken within the last few months, it was, I think, approximately 65% of Ukrainians want Ukraine to join NATO. At the very least, Ukrainians, and this is broadly agreed upon, Ukrainian-speaking, Russian-speaking, north, south, west, and even east in Ukraine, they want closer relations to the West. Ukrainians see themselves as European. but this is only part of the story, and I think it's dominated the quite a bit of the narrative. Putin has invaded, and the Russians have invaded Ukraine to keep Ukraine out of NATO. But the Ukrainians made clear in recent weeks that they were willing to even negotiate that goal. Really underlying Putin's agenda is historical argument. Enter the historian. And let's be clear, most of Putin's historical justification, his historical argument for attacking Ukraine is a set of bald-faced lies. In speeches and in essays, Putin has over and over essentially claimed that Ukraine is an invented country, that Ukrainians are a fabricated nationality. Putin argues that the land claimed as Ukraine has always been part of Russia, and the people who identify themselves as Ukrainian have essentially always been Russian. He further claims that the only times that Ukraine has existed as a sovereign state, and I'll talk more about that shortly, have been when it has been created, taken away from Russian territory, created, brought into being by enemies of Russia and friends of the West. Putin claims, he argues that in 1917, when starting in 1917 for 3 years, Ukraine existed as an independent sovereign state, it was Lenin who did it. And then he says in recent decades, it's essentially, it's the West in general, but it is really the United States, which has goaded Ukrainians, tempted Ukrainians, driven the Ukrainian drive to become part of NATO, to join the West, as it were. As I tell my students, this isn't a mystery novel. My lectures, my classes, my sessions aren't mystery novels, and I'm not going to force you to wait to the last minute to give away the whodunit. So let's be explicit upfront in calling these historical fabrications as such, and to label Putin's lies as such. Ukrainians have been, without a doubt, they have long existed as a people with a very clear sense of their own right to exist. They have long existed as a people with a very clear sense of their own identity, their own place in the world. It has long existed, Ukraine, as an idea, as a place, as a nation. And today, let's be very clear, Ukraine is a distinctive, a modern, a democratic, a peaceful, a sovereign state. Russia has no legitimate grievances against Ukraine that couldn't be solved by peaceful negotiations if Putin and the Russians wanted it. Therefore, let's be clear again, Russian aggression is illegitimate, it's probably criminal, it's surely damaging to the international order. In short, I would say that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has more to do with Russian historical lies and myths and Putin's own agenda and authoritarian control of Russia than it has to do with anything that Ukraine has done. Okay, the most essential of Putin's claims, and actually probably the one most widely shared by Russians, is that the first state on the territory that comes to be, there we go, that comes to be later the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, was, Putin would say, always Russian. Any state that has ever existed on this territory has always been Russian, including the very first one. This sounds, in a sense, obvious because you look at the map, you look at the territory, but in fact, it's based on historical manipulation of some basic historical knowledge. How so? Okay, the earliest state, the earliest organized state on this broad swath of territory is known as Kievan Rus. The word Russian comes from Rus later. It was established in the 9th century, so over a millennium ago, and as the name of this state implies, it was centered on the city of Kiev, right there in the middle of the map. A ruler of Kievan Rus, the Grand Prince Volodymyr the Great, in the 10th century was responsible for a very important development. This was his conversion to Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and then by extension, the conversion of his people. This is obviously a much later painting dramatizing Volodymyr the Great's conversion to Orthodox Christianity. So, in other words, Putin and many Russians believe that the Russian state and the Orthodox Church, the two most significant institutions in the history of Russia and this landmass, we could say, began in Kiev and were initiated by Russians. Russians claim Kiev, Kievan Rus, and the Orthodox Church. But, and here is the proverbial big but, Volodymyr and his subjects weren't Russian. They were probably best described as Eastern Slavs. Eastern Slavs were the ancestors of today's Russians and Ukrainians, and for that matter, Belarusians. So claiming that Kievan Rus is Russian is akin to Italians claiming that they founded Constantinople because the Romans did it in the 4th century. That's nonsense, and it's a nonsensical historical argument. In the case of the Eastern Slavs, we can't really speak of people who are distinctly Ukrainian and Russian until basically the 14th or the 15th century, probably at the earliest. At that point, the Russians, that is the people we would identify as identifiably Russian in terms of language and ethnic identity, had developed a state centered on the city of Moscow, which you will notice is not even on this map. The first mention of Moscow is in 1147, centuries after the establishment of Kiev. Key takeaway here is that while most Russians more or less would agree with Putin's assumption that Ukrainians are not really very different from Russians and that Ukraine is more or less a part of Russia, most Russians would also draw very different conclusions from that assumption. While Putin concludes that this justifies the invasion of Russia, the invasion of Ukraine, most Russians see Ukrainians not as a people to be erased or a people to be dominated, but as people who are brothers and sisters with a common origin. And this is very important, brothers and sisters in a common religion, brothers and sisters in Christ. So let me plant this question that we will want to circle back to. Why do Putin's assumptions about Ukraine lead to conclusions so out of step with the people he rules? Okay, the earliest society that we could probably identify as Ukrainian, as distinctive from the Russians, emerges around the 15th century. And this is the Cossacks. These people lived in the borderlands. Ukraine actually means borderland, between the Muscovite state, the state centered on Moscow in green here as it expands, Ottoman Turkey to the south, south of the Black Sea, and the Polish-Lithuanian state in East Central Europe, which in the 15th and 16th century had controlled much of what is purple on this map. So these people, Ukrainian Cossacks, living in much of modern day Ukraine, they pledged loyalty to various neighbors, including in particular Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. But then as Russia expanded in the 17th and 18th centuries, this increasingly meant that Ukrainian Cossacks, later we would simply say Ukrainians, they were pulled into Russia, conquered, annexed, forced into treaties, but they still saw themselves as a distinctive people who spoke a different language and were actually organized socially in a very different way than in the Muscovite and then the Russian state. You can see from this map, the dates are a little, the years are a little bit fuzzy and they're small, but by the 19th century, early in the 19th century, basically all the land, most of the land, except for the far northwestern part of Ukraine that makes up modern day Ukraine, had been absorbed by the expanding Russian Empire. At this point in the 19th century, the Ukrainian language mostly existed as lots of related local dialects, but it began to take its modern shape when ethnographers and writers traveled around Ukraine. They collected folk tales, they collected how people spoke, and they began to assemble the first Ukrainian dictionaries from this. And then they began to compose poetry and stories and literature in the Ukrainian language. Not surprisingly, more forceful efforts by Ukrainians to express themselves in Ukrainian and thus to assert their national identity brought forth harsher Russian reactions. Whereas before this, as the Russian state had grown, Russian rulers had sought accommodation with Ukrainian Cossacks, or simply the Ukrainians. But by the 19th century, the Russian state explicitly cracked down on the use of the Ukrainian language and went hard after expressions of Ukrainian national identity. Let's move into the 20th century. I want to identify five moments in the 20th century that are key to understand the relationship between Russia and Ukraine and the current conflict. In each of these five moments, it becomes very clear the clear articulation of a Ukrainian sense of identity and a drive for independence on the one hand, and on the other hand, an equally clear Russian effort to continue to dominate and subdue Ukrainian national identity. Okay, so 1917. 1917 was the year of two revolutions. And the first, illustrated in the upper left, a popular revolution overthrew the Russian Tsar and brought down the Russian Empire. In the second, illustrated in the lower right, the October Revolution brought Lenin and the communists to power and established the Soviet system. So between the two, between February and October of 1917, Vladimir Lenin wanted to undermine the new Russian government and to hasten the collapse of central authority. So he encouraged national independence movements. This is what Putin bases his assertion that it was Lenin behind the creation of the first Ukrainian state. Hogwash. The Ukrainians were well ahead of Lenin. They did not need him to encourage them. They jumped at the chance, and in fact, in the spring of 1917, we see the proclamation of the Ukrainian National Republic, which survived for 3 years. In the lower right, an image of a large assembly celebrating the creation of the Ukrainian Republic. In the upper left, its leadership. The lower left, the flag of Ukraine, as it is today. And in the upper right, the coat of arms of Ukraine now, of Ukraine then, some of which is used now. This is supposedly an image depicting Volodymyr the Great's trident. So this was the first time in modern history that an independent Ukrainian, identifiably Ukrainian state had come to exist. But the quickness with which it emerged had everything to do with the passion, the support of the people, intellectuals, and various activists. Of course, once the Bolsheviks withdrew from World War I, shored up their new revolutionary state and built up an army, they invaded. And within a few years, by 1920, Ukraine, the Ukrainian army had been defeated by the Bolsheviks and others, and absorbed into the new Soviet state as one of the constituent republics in the second half of the Soviet Union, one of the 15 constituent republics of the Soviet Union. After this, an independent Ukraine doesn't exist for another 71 years. Second moment in the 20th century that I want to talk about. Here is Joseph Stalin. And you could call this period the period of the Stalin Revolution. This was when, in the 1930s, Stalin led the campaign to quickly turn the Soviet Union into an industrial powerhouse that could hold its own, project its might against its neighbors, and extend the revolution into Europe. But to do so, he fostered deep paranoia, atomized society, and used terror throughout society. The violence of the Stalin years, the terror, the purges, led to the death of millions of people and the imprisonment of millions more so-called counter-revolutionaries in camps, the Gulag, across the Soviet Union. This period, though, was probably the most destructive and horrifying in the entire sweep of Ukrainian history, because a central feature of the Stalin years was a famine created by Stalin and his minions deliberately. Remember, Black Earth region, incredibly fertile soil, breadbasket of Europe. You could only have a famine in Europe from massive climactic changes that did not happen, droughts that did not happen, or by human intervention, by policy. And that's what Stalin did in 1932-33. The Holodomor, the hungry time, or the terror famine, as it comes to be known, killed probably 3 to 4 million Ukrainians at this time. It has been, in fact, characterized by some as a deliberate campaign of genocide carried out by the Soviet state against the Ukrainian people, as an effort to destroy Ukrainian national resistance to Soviet Russian control. By this map, you can see the impact, the demographic impact of the Holodomor, the hungry time. The areas colored dark orange, that's where 25% or more of the population disappeared. And the only parts that were not really touched by the Holodomor were the parts that, as of yet, were largely not yet in um, Ukraine, because they were at that time part of Poland during the interwar years. Stalin took advantage of the famine, the death of 3 to 4 million Ukrainians, and brought in ethnic Russians to repopulate these areas and to extend Soviet Russian control into Ukraine. Impose this map on the ethnic map I showed you at the beginning of this lecture. Not surprising, one of the great reasons why the East and the South has a larger percentage of ethnic Russians is the Holodomor of 1932-33. Third moment in the Russian-Ukrainian relationship in the 20th century is World War II, the core of which was in Europe, the Nazi-Soviet War, and quite tellingly known to Russians and Ukrainians and Soviets across the land as the Great Patriotic War. In Russian memory of the 20th century, this dominates everything else, even the Russian Revolution of 1917. And for Ukrainians, the memory, the national memory of the Great Patriotic War is probably second only to the Holodomor. Here we must remember that the Soviets did more than any other country in Europe to defeat Nazi Germany. They absorbed the greatest blows, they expended the most resources, and they lost the most people. And they concentrated German forces on their borders for the longest. And for generations of Soviets and then Russians, like Putin, this was the proof of Soviet greatness, not the achievement of any sort of communist goal or ideology, but defeat of Nazi Germany, because it marked the moment when the Soviet Union emerged as a superpower in the wake of the victory over Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union began to exert itself globally, geopolitically, and in the wake of the Great Patriotic War and the start of the Cold War, the Soviets imposed themselves on this string of countries, here colored pink, in Eastern Europe behind the Iron Curtain. And in essence, creating a Soviet empire. But this came at enormous cost for Soviets, for the USSR. The USSR lost somewhere between 25 and 30 million people. That amounts to about roughly 15% of the population at the time, which is hard to fathom for a country with such a large population. Every family lost members, lost relatives, lost neighbors. And of course, the casualties of the German invasion fell hardest on those parts of the Soviet Union in the West, Belarus and Ukraine, and also then because they were then occupied by Nazi Germany for 3 years. So the Russian story, the Soviet story of the Great Patriotic War is one of almost unimaginable suffering and sacrifice. And therefore, what happened in Ukraine, specifically in Ukraine during the Great Patriotic War, really complicates things. Remember, this long history of Russian efforts to absorb, to dominate, in some ways even to erase Ukraine and the Ukrainian people meant that in the summer of 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, lots of Ukrainians, as on the left, greeted the Germans as liberators. That they had come to free them, the Ukrainians, from Stalin and the Soviet system. On the right, we see a Ukrainian man dressed up in the costume, in the uniform, I should say, of a Hivi, an auxiliary soldier. And yes, indeed, many Ukrainians, particularly in the West, signed up to work with, to collaborate with the Germans, and therefore they took part in the Holocaust. They took part in rounding up and murdering what were Jews, what were their neighbors as well. And as I said before, Ukraine has a long history of and a rich history because of its Jews, because of that, because of the antagonisms that we see all over Europe throughout this period. It means there's also a long history of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic violence. So this Ukrainian betrayal to the Soviet Union, as Putin would term it, and of course Putin's anger isn't that that Ukrainian collaborators took part in the Holocaust, it's that they contributed to the German effort and resisted the Soviet Union. This is the origin of Vladimir Putin's oft-repeated claim that Ukraine's leaders are fascists now in 2022. And we've heard it in the last week when Putin announced the invasion of Ukraine and justified it. He said it's for two reasons. It's to demilitarize Ukraine, meaning decouple it from the West, make sure it never joins NATO, make it toothless. And he actually said denazification of Ukraine. Putin said the goal is to denazify Ukraine. Putin and some other Russian leaders and culture shapers, they draw a straight line from those with a strong Ukrainian national identity who resisted the Russians and the Soviets, to those who embraced Nazi Germany, right up to present day Ukrainians who want to draw closer to the West, which de facto Putin calls cuddling up, cozying up to Nazism. And it's true that there was and has been in the decades of Ukrainian independence a fringe neo-Nazi movement. Let's not deny that. But it's an open democratic country. People organize as they will, and some have organized in that way. But there's really good proof that this is a fringe movement, and it has really very little or nothing to do with Ukrainian politics today. And this man is Exhibit A, Volodymyr Zelensky, President of Ukraine. President Zelensky was elected in 2019 with over 70% of Ukrainians at the polls, so overwhelmingly favored. And Volodymyr Zelensky is a Jew. Volodymyr Zelensky is Jewish. The president of Ukraine today is Jewish. Volodymyr Zelensky, his great-grandfather was murdered by the Nazis. Two of Volodymyr Zelensky's great uncles were murdered by the Nazis in the Holocaust. Volodymyr Zelensky is not a Nazi, and there are no Nazis in his government. Back to the Great Patriotic War and the role it plays in Russian and Ukrainian national memory. So in 1941, the Soviets quickly realized that the German attack wasn't just an assault on their government or on their state, but an attack on their people, against the nations of the Soviet Union, Russians and Ukrainians, which Ukrainians, most of them realized very quickly. This was an invasion by Nazi Germany meant to enslave the Slavs of the Soviet Union, or in fact to wipe them out entirely. Almost the entire population, including within Ukraine, mobilized to fight against the Germans as soldiers, as factory workers, as farmers, people building roads and ports and canals, people taking part in the work of government, building defenses, and as partisans. There was an enormous partisan effort to fight against the Germans behind German lines. This has particularly struck me about the Ukrainian reaction to the Russian invasion, now in its fifth day, is how similar the Ukrainian reaction to the Russian invasion is to the Soviet, including the Ukrainian reaction to the German invasion. In Ukraine today, teachers and accountants and students and homemakers and businessmen, women and men, old people, young people all across Ukraine have responded by volunteering in the many thousands, by now it's surely the tens of thousands, for territorial defense militias. The videos we see, the stories we read of people saying, this is my land, this is my home, these are my people, this is my family, I will fight. And they take up arms, people who never thought they'd have to, don't want to, but they will. Images, stories of Ukrainian civilians making Molotov cocktails in the thousands, digging anti-tank trenches, organizing local patrols, doing anything they can to resist the Russians. These men and women, they were raised on stories of their grandparents, of their great-grandparents, defending their homes, their communities, their country against the Germans. And this is, I think, really one of the main ways in which I think had dramatically miscalculated, probably because he began to believe his own lies. Okay, I want to move to the collapse of the Soviet Union, moving ahead 40 years. The Soviet Union ended in 1991 because Gorbachev refused to use force to keep it together. This disintegration of the Soviet Union meant independence for all 14 of the former non-Russian republics, including Ukraine. In fact, a key moment in the collapse of it, here's the Soviet flag being lowered, the Russian flag being raised in December 91, was when Ukrainians held a referendum with more than 80% of Ukrainians voting in the referendum. Over 90% voted yes for independence. I see we're running out of time. I want to skip forward a little bit. I was going to talk more about the rise of Putin. The important thing to understand is that Putin, this former KGB man, has become a dictator in Russia by fueling nationalism, by fueling Russian humiliation, by fueling Russian grievance against the West, the expansion of NATO, the expansion of Western values, the expansion of Western businessmen and capital into Eastern Europe, into the former Soviet Union, and into Ukraine and Russia itself, fanning the flames of nationalism and hatred of the West. Some of these grievances are legitimate if they could have been pursued differently, have kept him in power and helped make him one of the richest men in the world. Meanwhile, Ukrainians rejected the developments going on in Russia and moved more and more to the West. In 2004 and 2014, Ukrainians staged protests and demonstrations and essentially forced a pro-Russian candidate to resign from office or elections to be retaken to kick him out and prevent him coming to office. Here's a demonstration in late 2013 that led to the second of these events. You see the Ukrainian flag and you see the European Union flag. Ukrainians see themselves as European. Many want to become part of NATO. More broadly, they simply want to join the West. They see that as their future. I've got about 10 minutes left. I wasn't going to get into details about the war. I'm going to stop here. We can talk about that if anybody has any questions. And again, I'm happy to stay on a little bit longer, past 8.
Yeah, Randy, we've had some good questions on the chat. If I could share these with you. One participant asked, whether Russia wins or loses, what do you see as the major long-term consequences for Russia from this move?
There are many. I think one of the most important ones more broadly is that NATO floated almost looking for a reason for its existence in the 1990s. It expanded almost like a shark having to keep moving. What Putin has done has given a new reason to exist to NATO. Within Russia, this is an unpopular war to the degree to which Russians even know what's going on. They're going to be devastated economically. The ruble is crashing. And particularly the Western effort to isolate the Russian central bank and freeze its resources means that the currency is going to be devalued. Everything is going to be more expensive. It'll be difficult to travel. The really interesting question, and of course we cannot predict it. I won't predict it. At what point does Russian anger against the West for imposing sanctions turn into Russian anger against Putin for inviting this down on Russia? Putin stays in power because he has the support of basically the military industrial complex and oligarchs who have gotten rich on this crony capitalist system he has created. And he stays in power because he manipulates popular opinion through this sense of humiliation and grievance. At what point does this give way? Of course, it's the media space in Russia is not free. People are cynical about their news. People are questioning how to get good information, what it means. At some point, is this going to break through? We'll see.
Yeah. Another question, this might be from one of your former students in your terrorism class, and they ask, could Putin's statements, for example, referencing nuclear weapons and that sort of thing, or other statements that he's made, to what extent could these be considered terrorism?
I wouldn't consider it that. I mean, this is the realm of geopolitics, and this is a threat that has teeth to it, that's intended to sway the governments of the West. This is more literal violence and the threat of grand strategic violence, not the sort of symbolic violence that is key to terrorism.
And this question is rather interesting. Have you heard, or how are the acquaintances and friends that you met in Odessa? Have you heard anything from them, or what is happening
Yeah.
there as far as you know?
Unfortunately, when my wife and I and our son lived in Odessa, I was on a research scholarship, which meant I was hunkered down in libraries and archives while I was there. So we made some friends there. There unfortunately weren't folks that I remained close to after we left, but I remember a lot of people, librarians and archivists and people at restaurants where we ate, and students and faculty at the university where I was affiliated. And I think about them and I wonder what
Yeah.
they're doing. And Russian troops have driven north from Crimea and then turned west towards, on the screen is represented, toward Kherson and Odessa. Ukrainians in Odessa are hunkered down waiting for the Russians to come. And I bet some of those people that I met and people I brushed elbows with on trams and buses and on the street are arming themselves and are digging trenches on the outskirts of Odessa. They're going to fight the Russians when they come.
Yeah, and we've got time for about one more question, and before I have to formally cut it off, and I know you graciously agreed to continue to answer questions, but this person asked, to what extent do you think maybe Putin, in doing this, is deliberately trying to create a very large humanitarian crisis for the West, to destabilize the West, and that this was maybe part of his plan?
I think Putin is a crafty fellow. Um, I think anything that he imagines that would undermine or destabilize the West is a good thing. Um, Russian meddling in American elections via social media wasn't really meant to get a particular candidate elected or to establish a particular point of view. Rather, it was um, to in sowing disinformation to undercut belief in these key democratic institutions, openness, freedom, the power of debate, interaction, the sense that we could come together to solve our problems. So um, I think that the invasion of Ukraine, he welcomes a humanitarian crisis. In his case, it's driven, I think, still by these deeper seated attitudes, which is what I try to emphasize throughout my talk. Um, Talk about the Donbass, talk about immediate membership of Ukraine in NATO, humanitarian crisis. In a sense, all of these things are subsumed under his belief that the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, has to be reset, and that Ukraine, by all reason and justification, is a part of Russia and needs to be reincorporated, whether directly or indirectly. That's a good question, though.
Well, Randy, unfortunately we are at the 8 o'clock hour, and I know I speak for all of, I believe, over 300 participants in this program this evening. I know I speak for everyone in thanking you for this wonderful presentation, and I want to thank all the participants for joining us, and I wish everyone good night and forward ever. But we will continue. Randy is going to stay on here a little bit for those who would like to stay on and ask some more questions. And I believe that you can be unmuted to ask those questions, or perhaps Randy can follow in the chat room and answer those. And again, thanks to everyone for joining us, and good night and good luck.
I want to say thank you for everybody who tuned in. I know the president's giving his state of address meeting in just a moment here. The talk has formally ended, but I'm happy to answer some questions. I see some questions on how I think this is going to end. I have no idea, but I see in the short term. I think we've seen how it's been obvious to everyone, much to Putin's humiliation, that the Russian military has not achieved its objectives. They've slowed down, poor planning, poor logistical planning. This is unfortunately probably temporary because the Russians have such advantages in size. They're going to bring more troops to bear. They have so much of an advantage in technology, but in particular, they have an extraordinary advantage in terms of firepower. They've sought to limit it a little bit, to limit civilian casualties in urban areas. But as the resistance continues, as the Russian military pushes into the big cities, Kyiv, most importantly, Kherson, maybe Odessa in the south, Kharkiv in the northeast, the fighting will shift into cities. And it has the real danger to have just catastrophic civilian casualties and catastrophic urban damage. The Ukrainians will resist with man-portable weapons, anti-tank, anti-air weapons. But if the Russians have the means with these massive Grad rocket launchers and cluster bombs and artillery and cruise missiles to inflict horrible damage. And so that is in the near term, like right now in the next few days, what I'm most afraid of. Let's see. We don't know how it's going to end also in terms of, are they simply going to, do the Russians simply want to occupy Kyiv, decapitate the government, get Zelensky, put in a puppet government, and then somehow withdraw? Do they want to carve off part of the territory? I have a hard time imagining an actual occupation of Ukraine of the entire Ukraine by the Russian military. Ukraine, I don't think I mentioned the number. It's a country of about 42 million. If you take out the Donbass and Crimea, it's a few million less than that. I find that to be an impossible idea that Russia would be able to occupy it. I say a question about Putin and his mental stability. There's always a real danger here of being armchair psychologists when you can't actually talk and investigate, as it were, the person you're trying to make sense of. I think he's desperate. He's always had a reputation as being brutal, but as being clever, a tactician, incremental. He seems to have abandoned that, but I think it's because he has finally found his moment where he is going to correct what he sees as a historical wrong. That's why Donbass, Crimea, some of these things, negotiations over Ukrainian participation in NATO, I think these are in some ways peripheral. They're not red herrings, but they all come from something deeper, which is his attitude towards the collapse of the Soviet Union in '91, and his attitude towards Ukraine's specific role, and how Ukraine is the most visible way in which Russia has been denied its heritage, its legacy, its land, that connection to the earliest Russian state and the Orthodox Church. I'm scanning some questions here. The role of China is fascinating. The increasingly close relationship between China and Russia, between Xi Jinping and Putin. I would not. That's not my field of expertise. I wouldn't venture too much into that. Although to say, I think this is not what the Chinese signed on for. Getting dragged into, being tethered to a pariah state. On the other hand, it, the world is distracted. I think that's a concern as well, what the Chinese might be up to. I think I saw earlier some question about Germany. This is a fascinating one. This is remaking European history right now, not just Russian history, not just Ukrainian history. This is remaking European history. And as I said before, it's revivifying NATO. It gives NATO a new reason to exist, and it's also convinced. If Putin's goal was to decouple Ukraine from NATO, it's done the opposite. It's convinced everyone across Europe, everyone in those former satellite states, the Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians, the Ukrainians. It's convinced them that Russia is a threat to their existence. And in Germany, in the last couple of days, we've seen the Germans agree to send lethal military equipment into a combat zone to aid the Ukrainians. This is new for Germany. They've committed already to increase their defense spending, their defense budget, and perhaps even to write it into the budget, into the constitution for future budgets in Germany. This is an extraordinary development. Probably it will speed up, I would guess, Sweden and Finland trying to join NATO. Here's a question about the possibility of a long-term Ukrainian insurgency. I think so. I think that there are already people in positions of leadership in the United States saying that if Kyiv falls, if Zelensky is captured, killed, gone, if the central government is knocked out, what should the West, what should the United States do? Many have said, we fund an insurgency, not unlike supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. And then given the economic damage back home, once the Russians blow through their reserves of hard currency, it'll become a difficult operation to maintain, a counterinsurgency against a committed enemy that wants the Russians off their soil. It of course increases dramatically the civilian casualties in Ukraine, the number of human rights abuses, the damage to people and society will be enormous. As the body count goes up, though, as the death toll increases for the Russians as occupiers, that could potentially destabilize Russia as well, which people might jump and say that's a good thing. A weakened Russian government, a Putin out of power, can't but be a good thing. Well, a desperate dictator with nuclear weapons is bad enough. A collapsing government in a state that has nuclear weapons, with competition at the center for who succeeds, is even worse. So chaos, anarchy, some sort of disintegration in Russia is a very dangerous idea to consider. I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'm not even saying we're anywhere close to that yet. but that is most certainly a possibility. Parallels to Munich. Yeah. Before the invasion actually happened, I was likening with some of my friends the Donbass, these areas in the southeast, Donetsk and Luhansk, almost kind of like to a Sudetenland, the way in which Putin was using the idea that the people in the Donbass were being had to rebel and Russia had to back them to save them from being targeted by the Russians. But it's even beyond that, because Russian media, Russian propaganda has been spreading the idea without any basis. Let's be very clear here, that Ukrainians hate Russians, that Ukrainians hate the Russian language, that this has been going on for years, that the Ukrainians are forbidding the use of Russian, that ethnic Russians in Ukraine who use Russian are targeted, are attacked, are lynched, are killed, are bullied. No, I mean, there are occasional examples of this, but there's no state policy and it's not a widespread event. But so Putin definitely said, in part, we have to go into Ukraine and rescue ethnic Russians and rescue the people who really should be Russian from this militarized pro-Western Nazi government that is dead set on almost exterminating ethnic Russians on Ukrainian soil. So these are ideas that have a lot of, that are widely circulated in Russian media. Anybody want to jump on? Anybody want to unmute themselves if they can and just pop on with a question? I'd be happy to take one or two more, if that's possible.
Hey, Randy, this is Lars Porter on
Hey.
Dana's. We still have 163 people on, so if we unmute, I'm not sure that's going to be manageable. I think
right
in the feed is probably still best until our numbers drop a little bit further.
You're right. That's a heck of a lot of people, which is very gratifying. I'm glad to see so many people here. Let's see. Oh yeah, given the emphasis on this was a direct message, I think, on Ukrainian nationalism and national identity. Will this encourage a more extreme and potentially more radical, less democratic, less tolerant Ukrainian nationalism? And I think, of course, it will. I think the bulk of the Ukrainian population, the tone, the tenor of the Ukrainian people and their development in recent years is towards inclusion and is tolerance. This is one of the things that I loved the most about my time in Ukraine and about Ukraine itself, is a sort of go along to get along attitude. You do your thing, you do your thing. A sort of tolerance. You speak Ukrainian, you speak Russian. It's fine because we're all Ukrainian here. You have your ethnic past, you have your ethnic past. Yours is Jewish, yours is Tatar, whatever. Let's all agree that we can do that within a multi-ethnic Ukraine. And that's, I think, that's like the best of Europe. That's not always been the case in Europe. That's the best of Europe. That will be challenged. There will be many who say we were too tolerant. There will be some who said we were too accepting of Russians. We allowed this danger to grow in our midst. And of course, that kind of discussion of the enemy, the dehumanization of the enemy, will lead to a growth of a stronger right wing Ukrainian movement. Of course, now, if it's, being occupied, well, obviously that's going to usher, if Ukraine is occupied or chunks of it are occupied by the Russians, that's obviously going to bring forth a visceral, violent response. Let's see. Oh, I love this. Given Putin's claims to a mythos of Volodymyr the Great, yeah, or Vladimir the Great. Oh, yeah, the idea of a Russian re-entry, reclaiming Kyiv, it does hold not just a mythic, but almost a mystical meaning for Putin and some Russians. Oh, the relation with the church, I'm not going to get into that. That's not my area of specialty, but that's a fantastic question. Well, somebody asked about Moldova or Finland. I mean, one of the specialties of the Russians in the last 14 years has been what have been called frozen conflicts. Instigate a conflict, back a separatist movement, claim Russia is only getting involved to protect a Russian ethnic population in this area, and then back them, and then essentially shut down any sort of negotiations that would normalize affairs and sort of readmit this occupied territory, occupied by separatists, backed by the Russian military, back to the country from which it came. And then it just stays like that. We have this in Georgia, in a section of Georgia, South Ossetia, which is still nominally Georgian in the Caucasus, but is essentially functioning as a little adjunct of Russia. It happened in a part of Moldova, to the west of Ukraine, a little strip across the Dniester River, broke away, claimed repression at the hands of Moldovans, is backed by Russia. Frozen conflict, that's going on now for more than 15 years. The Donbass, you could even say that almost with Crimea. So this has become a favorite tactic, a favorite Putin-esque tactic. And I think the Finns during the Cold War basically did this, I mean, I guess a little bit of a variant. Their contract, as it were, with the Russians was that Finland would be autonomous, but would coordinate foreign policy with the Russians, which was an abridgment of their sovereignty, but they understood that as the best way forward. I think given Putin's behavior, Swedes definitely and Finns likely will abandon that and throw in their lot with NATO. Anytime, though, of course, that we have more, as the lines get hardened, as the tensions get greater, there's always the danger, as the rhetoric gets more extreme, the danger of what's going on in Ukraine spilling over and triggering a wider conflict is very, very real. And it can be small. It could be just a minor miscalculation. It can be a salvo of rockets that go across the border. If the Russians start targeting the European importation of weapons from across the Polish or the Romanian border, the Russians are going to target those convoys. What happens if they start shooting across the border? What happens if they stray into Polish or Romanian airspace? What happens if a plane gets shot down? It's easy for miscalculations, minor incidents, when everybody is so tense, to spiral out of control. I'm not predicting nuclear war, but the danger of a broader conflict is real. you think the West, this was a direct message, do you think the West can put strong enough sanctions for Russian oligarchs to firmly oppose Putin? The oligarchs they've gotten rich off of their relationship with Putin. Basically, in the 90s, the only people who knew what infrastructure that was being sold off to the Russian people, the only people who knew what that infrastructure was worth was government insiders and kind of the old black market Soviet mafia. And they essentially came together to loot and pillage Soviet infrastructure when it was being privatized. So from early on, there was a marriage between Russian politicians and many of whom were simply ex-Soviet politicians, and a kind of criminal element. And so many of these oligarchs, if they've been around enough, they've got shady backgrounds, but they got rich off of this marriage, this partnership. And of course, he crushes some of them occasionally when they step out of line. But again, there's a calculation amongst the rest of him that Putin is still good for our bank account. At some point, that might well not be the case. If the ruble tanks, if Russia uses up its foreign currency stockpiles, if Russia can't import goods, so on and so forth. There might come a time when the oligarchs give up their support, but there's no way for them to organize except back channels conspiratorially. And Putin has done a good job of undermining that in recent decades. There is no organized national political opposition that could take up the mantle or jump in if something happens to Putin. There is almost no free media. There are only a couple newspapers, a couple TV stations, channels in a country of 150 some million people. So there are not that many ways in which an opposition can emerge, which is dangerous. Poland. This is before Mark Lester passed on the question about was part of Putin's calculation to create a humanitarian crisis, maybe. But this is obviously one of the many interesting stories here, and it's got an up and a downside. The degree to which Europeans, particularly Poles and Romanians, Slovaks, people right on the border, right on the front line there with Ukraine, and absorbing this humanitarian rush, up to like 700,000 people now. The degree to which they've opened their arms, and the language in which we've been seeing this is of welcoming Ukrainians as Europeans. You are one of us. Of course, we're going to be here to help you. There have been isolated reports of Africans or South Asians, East Asians who are living, working, studying, whatever, in Kyiv and Ukraine, fleeing with other refugees and being turned away or being hassled because they're not the European Ukrainians that are being welcomed. Those are troubling anecdotes. I don't think it's on a really wide scale, but it does highlight how, and it reminds us how very recently Europe in general, Germany in particular, absorbed so many Syrian refugees in particular, and how this is destabilizing people, bringing in people of a different language, different culture, different religion, so on and so forth. But simply the sheer numbers, how do you accommodate them, and the impact on the economy? We're going to see what happens there. What is your sense of how much the average Russian citizen knows about this? There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that there's not. I don't think I included this little bit. According to there's a lot of polling in Ukraine as a free and open society. There's much less polling, public opinion polling that goes on in Russia. It's much more difficult. There's a lot of interference with it. I read one story not that long ago that back in December, there was a public opinion poll that asked Russians, a representative number of Russians, if they supported war against Ukraine. And like people who said yes it was like 8%. I'm going to put a big asterisk after that. I don't know if that's true. But I would think in general, and this is one of the things I wanted to highlight, if Putin thinks that Ukrainians are essentially fake Russians who've stolen their territory and should be invaded, most Russians would say Ukrainian, it's maybe not that distinctive of a nationality or an ethnicity or a language, but in a sense, I don't care because they're my brothers. If you're old enough, you had Ukrainian friends all over the place in the Soviet Union. People have relatives, Ukrainians living in Russia. People have, Russians have relatives living in Ukraine. And there's this sense of a common heritage. And there have been stories of Russians being told that they were on military exercises. And then when they find that they're being asked to shoot and kill and bombard Ukrainians, they are less than happy. Is there a point at which they will actually resist? Hard to say. Is there a point at which that information trickling back to Russia grows into some sort of movement? I've read that there's a petition that is circling online, which of course is the freest space that you could still get to in Russia, that has attracted over 1 million signatures of people saying, stop this war. We'll see. It's really gratifying to see how many people signed on to this lecture. It's the degree to which Ukraine is personally important to me. I love seeing this kind of interest in it. This is bigger than any one of us, and certainly bigger than my personal investment in Ukraine. I'm not Ukrainian, wouldn't pretend to be. This is an event of world historical import. In terms of economics and geopolitics right now, it's absolutely at the top of the list of issues that we have to deal with, I think. So it's good to see so many people interested. I love seeing alumni and former students and friends and people from all over the country. So thank you very much for attending. Thank you, Lars, for helping out.
It's my pleasure. And a lot of people have said thank you in the chat, but I'll echo it one more time. We appreciate everything.
Thank you so much, folks. Be safe.
One question that I have not answered yet is this video, when I stop recording it, is going to be available through the alumni office, and I'll let them distribute it through the channels that they will. So
it is going to be available. I don't know if it'll be through Alumni Affairs or Communications, but yes, it will be available. So thank you, people. Keep informed, but always pay attention to where you're getting your information. Put it into the context that that I and others provide, and then be skeptical and be curious. Thank you again. Thank you, Lars. Take care, everyone. Be safe.